Answer to Job, Part 3. If the original father Adam is a copy of the Creator, his son Cain is certainly a copy of God's son, Satan, and this gives us good reason for supposing that God's favorite Abel must also have his correspondence in a supra-celestial place. The ominous happenings that occur right at the beginning of a seemingly successful and satisfactory creation, the fall and the fratricide, catch our attention, and one is forced to admit that the initial situation, when the Spirit of God brooded over the tohu-bohu, hardly permits us to expect an absolutely perfect result. Furthermore, the Creator, who found every other day of his work good, failed to give good marks to what happened on Monday. He simply said nothing, a circumstance that favors an argument from silence. What happened on that day was the final separation of the upper from the lower waters by the interposed plate of the firmament. It is clear that this unavoidable dualism refused, then as later, to fit smoothly into the concept of monotheism, because it points to a metaphysical disunity. This split, as we know from history, had to be patched up again and again through the centuries, concealed and denied. It had made itself felt from the very beginning in paradise, through a strange inconsequence which befell the Creator or was put over on him. Instead of following his original program of letting man appear on the last day as the most intelligent being and Lord of all creatures, he created the serpent, who proved to be much more intelligent and more conscious than Adam, and in addition had been created before him. We can hardly suppose that Yahweh would have played such a trick on himself. He is a trickster and spoilsport who loves nothing better than to cause annoying accidents. Although Yahweh had created the reptiles before Adam, they were common or garden snakes, highly unintelligent, from among whom Satan selected a tree snake to use as his disguise. From then on, the rumor spread that the snake was the most spiritual animal. Later, the snake became the favorite symbol of the noose, received high honors, and was even permitted to symbolize God's second son, because the latter was interpreted as the world-redeeming Logos, which frequently appears as identical with the noose. A legend of later origin maintains that the snake in the Garden of Eden was Lilith, Adam's first wife, with whom he begot a horde of demons. This legend likewise supposes a trick that can hardly have been intended by the Creator. Consequently, the Bible knows only of Eve as Adam's legitimate wife. It nevertheless remains a strange fact that the original man who was created in the image of God had, according to tradition, 2 wives, just like his heavenly prototype. Just as Yahweh is legitimately united with his wife Israel, but has a feminine pneuma as his intimate playmate from all eternity, so Adam first has Lilith, the daughter or emanation of Satan, to wife, as a satanic correspondence to Sophia. Eve would then correspond to the people of Israel. We naturally do not know why we should hear at such a late date that the Ruach Elohim, the Spirit of God, is not only feminine but a comparatively independent being who exists side by side with God, and that long before the marriage with Israel, Yahweh had had relations with Sophia. Nor do we know why in the older tradition the knowledge of this first alliance had been lost. Likewise, it was only quite late that one heard of the delicate relationship between Adam and Lilith. Whether Eve was a troublesome wife for Adam as the children of Israel, who were perpetually flirting with unfaithfulness, or for Yahweh, is equally dark to us. At any rate, the family life of our first parents was not all beer and skittles. Their first 2 sons are a typical pair of hostile brothers, for at that time it was apparently still the custom to live out mythological motifs in reality. Nowadays this is felt to be objectionable and is denied whenever it happens. The parents can share the blame for original sin. Adam has only to remember his demon princess, and Eve should never forget that she was the first to fall for the wiles of the serpent. Like the fall, the Cain-Abel intermezzo can hardly be listed as one of creation's shining successes. One must draw this conclusion because Yahweh himself did not appear to be informed in advance of the above-mentioned incidents. Here, as later, there is reason to suspect that no conclusions were ever drawn from omniscience. Yahweh did not consult his total knowledge and was accordingly surprised by the result. One can observe the same phenomenon in human beings, wherever in fact people cannot deny themselves the pleasure of their emotions. It must be admitted that a fit of rage or a sulk has its secret attractions. Were that not so, most people would long since have acquired a little wisdom. From this point of view, we may be in a better position to understand what happened to Job. In the pleuromatic, or as the Tibetans call it, bardo state, there is a perfect interplay of cosmic forces, but with the creation, that is, with the division of the world into distinct processes in time and space, events begin to rub and jostle one another. Covered by the hem of the paternal mantle, Satan soon starts putting a right touch here and a wrong touch there, thus giving rise to complications which were apparently not intended in the Creator's plan, and which come as surprises. While unconscious creation, animals, plants, and crystals, functions satisfactorily so far as we know, things are constantly going wrong with man. At first, his consciousness is only a very little higher than that of the animals, for which reason his freedom of will is also extremely limited. But Satan takes an interest in him and experiments with him in his own way, leading him into all sorts of wickedness, while his angels teach him the arts and sciences, which until now had been reserved for the perfection of the pleroma. Even in those days, Satan would have merited the name of Lucifer. The peculiar, unforeseen antics of men arouse Yahweh's wrath, and thereby involve him in his own creation. Divine interventions become a compelling necessity. Irritatingly enough, they only meet with temporary success. Even the draconian punishment of drowning all life with a few choice exceptions, a fate which, according to old Johann Jacob Schexer, on the evidence of the fossils, not even the fishes escaped, had no lasting effect. Creation remained just as tainted as before. The strange thing is that Yahweh invariably seeks the reason for this in man, who apparently refuses to obey, but never in his Son, the father of all tricksters. This false orientation cannot fail to exasperate his already touchy nature, so that fear of God is regarded by man in general as the principle and even as the beginning of all wisdom. While mankind tried, under this hard discipline, to broaden their consciousness by acquiring a modicum of wisdom, that is, a little foresight and reflection, it is clear from the historical development that Yahweh had lost sight of his pleuromatic coexistence with Sophia since the days of the creation. Her place was taken by the covenant with the chosen people, who were thus forced into the feminine role. At that time, the people consisted of a patriarchal society in which women were only a secondary importance. God's marriage with Israel was therefore an essentially masculine affair, something like the founding of the Greek polis, which occurred about the same time. The inferiority of women was a settled fact. Woman was regarded as less perfect than man, as Eve's weakness for the blandishments of the serpent amply proved. Perfection is a masculine desideratum, while woman inclines by nature to completeness. It is a fact that even today a man can stand a relative state of perfection much better and for a longer period than a woman, while as a rule it does not agree with women and may even be dangerous for them. If a woman strives for perfection, she forgets the contemporary role of completeness, which, though imperfect by itself, forms the necessary counterpart to perfection. For just as completeness is always imperfect, so perfection is always incomplete, and therefore represents a final state which is hopelessly sterile. Ex perfecto nihil fit, say the old masters, whereas the imperfectum carries within it the seed of its own improvement. Perfectionism always ends in a blind alley, while completeness by itself lacks selective values. At the bottom of Yahweh's marriage with Israel is a perfectionist intention which excludes that kind of relatedness we know as eros. The lack of eros, of relationship to values, is painfully apparent in the book of Job. The paragon of all creation is not a man, but a monster. Yahweh has no eros, no relationship to man, but only to a purpose man must help him fulfill. But that does not prevent him from being jealous and mistrustful like any other husband, though even here he has his purpose in mind, and not man. The faithfulness of his people becomes the more important to him the more he forgets wisdom. But again and again they slip back into unfaithfulness despite the many proofs of his favor. This behavior naturally does nothing to mollify Yahweh's jealousy and suspicions. Hence Satan's insinuations fall on fertile ground when he drips his doubt about Jacob's faithfulness into the paternal ear. Against his own convictions, Yahweh agrees without any hesitation to inflict the worst tortures on him. One misses Sophia's love of mankind more than ever. Even Job longs for the wisdom which is nowhere to be found. Job marks the climax of this unhappy development. He epitomizes a thought which had been maturing in mankind about that time, a dangerous thought that makes great demands on the wisdom of gods and men. Though conscious of these demands, Job obviously does not know enough about the Sophia who is co-eternal with God. Because man feels himself at the mercy of Yahweh's capricious will, he is in need of wisdom. Not so Yahweh, who up to now has had nothing to contend with except man's nothingness. With the Job drama, however, the situation undergoes a radical change. Here Yahweh comes up against a man who stands firm, who clings to his rights until he is compelled to give way to brute force. He has seen God's face and the unconscious split in his nature. God was now known, and this knowledge went on working not only in Yahweh, but in man too. Thus it was that men of the last few centuries before Christ, who at the gentle touch of the pre-existent Sophia compensate Yahweh and his attitude, and at the same time complete the anamnesis of wisdom, taking a highly personified form that is clear proof of her autonomy. Wisdom reveals herself to men as a friendly helper, an advocate against Yahweh, and shows the bright side, the kind, just, the amiable aspect of their God. At the time when Satan's practical joke with the snake compromised the paradise that was planned to be perfect, Yahweh banished Adam and Eve, whom he had created as images of his masculine essence and his feminine emanation, to the extra-paradisal world, the limbo of shards. It is not clear how much of Eve represents Sophia, and how much of her is Lilith. At any rate, Adam has priority in every respect. Eve was taken out of his body as an afterthought. I mention these details from Genesis only because the reappearance of Sophia in the heavenly regions points to a coming act of creation. She is indeed the master workman. She realizes God's thoughts by clothing them in material form, which is the prerogative of all feminine beings. Her coexistence with Yahweh signifies the perpetual hieros gamos from which worlds are begotten and born. A momentous change is imminent. God desires to regenerate himself in the mystery of the heavenly nuptials, as the chief gods of Egypt had done from time immemorial, and to become man. For this he uses the Egyptian model of the god's incarnation in Pharaoh, which in its turn is but a copy of the eternal hieros gamos in the pleroma. It would, however, be wrong to suppose that this archetype is merely repeating itself mechanically. So far as we know, this is never the case, since archetypal situations only return when specifically called for. The real reason for God's becoming man is to be sought in his encounter with Job. Later on we shall deal with this question in more detail. Chapter 4. Just as the decision to become man apparently makes use of the ancient Egyptian model, so we can expect that the process itself will follow certain prefigurations. The approach of Sophia betokens a new creation, but this time it is not the world that is to be changed, rather it is God who intends to change his own nature. Mankind is not, as before, to be destroyed, but saved. In this decision we can discern the philanthropic influence of Sophia. No new human beings are to be created, but only one, the God-man. For this purpose, a contrary procedure must be employed. The second Adam shall not, like the first, proceed directly from the hand of the Creator, but shall be born of a human woman. So this time priority falls to the second Eve, not only in a temporal sense, but in a material sense as well. On the basis of the so-called proto-evangelium, the second Eve corresponds to the woman and her seed, mentioned in Genesis 3:15, which shall bruise the serpent's head. Just as Adam was believed to be originally hermaphroditic, so the woman and her seed are thought of as a human pair, as the Queen of Heaven and Mother of God, and as the Divine Son who has no human father. Thus Mary the Virgin is chosen as the pure vessel for the coming birth of God. Her independence of the male is emphasized by her virginity as the sine qua non of the process. She is a daughter of God, who, as a later dogma will establish, is distinguished at the outset by the privilege of an immaculate conception, and is thus free from the taint of original sin. It is therefore evident that she belongs to the state before the fall. This posits a new beginning. The divine immaculateness of her status makes it immediately clear that she not only bears the image of God in undiminished purity, but as the bride of God is also the incarnation of her prototype, namely Sophia. Her love of mankind, widely emphasized in the ancient writings, suggests that in this newest creation of his, Yahweh has allowed himself to be extensively influenced by Sophia. For Mary, the blessed among women, is a friend and intercessor for sinners, which all men are. Like Sophia, she is a mediatrix who leads the way to God and assures men of immortality. Her assumption is therefore the prototype of man's bodily resurrection. As the bride of God and Queen of Heaven, she holds the place of the Old Testament Sophia. Remarkable indeed are the unusual precautions which surround the making of Mary: immaculate conception, extirpation of the taint of sin, everlasting virginity. The Mother of God is obviously being protected against Satan's tricks. From this we can conclude that Yahweh has consulted his own omniscience, for in his omniscience there is a clear knowledge of the perverse intentions which lurk in the dark Son of God. Mary must at all costs be protected from these corrupting influences. The inevitable consequence of all these elaborate protective measures is something that has not been sufficiently taken into account in the dogmatic evaluation of the Incarnation. Her freedom from original sin sets Mary apart from mankind in general, whose common characteristic is original sin, and therefore the need of redemption. The status ante lapsum is tantamount to a paradisal, i.e. pleuromatic, in divine existence. By having these special measures applied to her, Mary is elevated to the status of a goddess, and consequently loses something of her humanity. She will not conceive her child in sin, like all other mothers, and therefore he also will never be a human being, but a god. To my knowledge, at least, no one has ever perceived that this queers the pitch for a genuine incarnation of God, or rather that the incarnation was only partially consummated. Both mother and son are not real human beings at all, but gods. This arrangement, though it had the effect of exalting Mary's personality in the masculine sense by bringing it closer to the perfection of Christ, was at the same time injurious to the feminine principle of imperfection or completeness, since this was reduced by the perfectionizing tendency to the little bit of imperfection that still distinguishes Mary from Christ. Phoebo proprior lumino perdit. Thus, the more the feminine ideal is bent in the direction of the masculine, the more the woman loses her power to compensate the masculine striving for perfection, and a typically masculine ideal state arises, which, as we shall see, is threatened with an enantiodromia. No path leads beyond perfection into the future. There is only a turning back, a collapse of the ideal, which could easily have been avoided by paying attention to the feminine ideal of completeness. Yahweh's perfectionism is carried over from the Old Testament into the New, and despite all the recognition and glorification of the feminine principle, this never prevailed against the patriarchal supremacy. We have not, therefore, by any means heard the last of it. Chapter 5. The older son of the first parents was corrupted by Satan and not much of a success. He was an eidolon of Satan, and only the younger son, Abel, was pleasing to God. In Cain the God image was distorted, but in Abel it was considerably less dimmed. If Adam is thought of as a copy of God, then God's successful son, who served as a model for Abel, and about whom, as we have seen, there are no available documents, is the prefiguration of the God-man. Of the latter we know positively that, as the Logos, he is pre-existent and co-eternal with God, indeed of the same substance as he. One can therefore regard Abel as the imperfect prototype of God's Son, who is about to be begotten in Mary. Just as Yahweh originally undertook to create a chthonic equivalent of himself in the first man, Adam, so now he intends something similar, but much better. The extraordinary precautionary measures above mentioned are designed to serve this purpose. The new Son, Christ, shall, on the one hand, be a chthonic man like Adam, mortal and capable of suffering, but on the other hand he shall not be like Adam, a mere copy, but God himself, begotten by himself as the Father, and rejuvenating the Father as the Son. As God he has always been God, and as the Son of Mary, who is plainly a copy of Sophia, he is the Logos, synonymous with nous, who, like Sophia, is a master workman, as stated by the Gospel according to St. John. This identity of mother and son is borne out over and over again in the myths. Although the birth of Christ is an event that occurred but once in history, it has always existed in eternity. For the layman in these matters, the identity of a non-temporal eternal event with a unique historical occurrence is something that is extremely difficult to conceive. He must, however, accustom himself to the idea that time is a relative concept, and needs to be complemented by that of the simultaneous existence, in the bardo or pleroma, of all historical processes. What exists in the pleroma as an eternal process appears in time as an aperiodic sequence. That is to say, it is repeated many times in an irregular pattern. To take but one example, Yahweh had one good son and one who was a failure. Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, correspond to this prototype, and so in all ages and in all parts of the world does the motif of the hostile brothers, which innumerable modern variants still cause dissension in families and keeps the psychotherapist busy. Just as many examples, no less instructive, could be found in the two women prefigured in eternity. When these things occur as modern variants, therefore they should not be regarded merely as personal episodes, moods, or chance idiosyncrasies in people, but as fragments of the pleuromatic process itself, which, broken up into individual events occurring in time, is an essential component or aspect of the divine drama. When Yahweh created the world from his prima materia, the void, he could not help breathing his own mystery into the creation which is himself in every part, as every reasonable theology has long been convinced. From this comes the belief that it is possible to know God from his creation. When I say that he could not help doing this, I do not imply any limitation of his omnipotence. On the contrary, it is an acknowledgement that all possibilities are contained in him, and that there are, in consequence, no other possibilities than those which express him. All the world is God's, and God is in all the world from the very beginning. Why then the tour de force of the Incarnation? One asks oneself, astonished. God is in everything already, and yet there must be something missing if a sort of second entrance into creation has now to be staged with so much care and circumspection. Since creation is universal, reaching to the remotest stellar galaxies, and since it has also made organic life infinitely variable and capable of endless differentiation, we can hardly see where the defect lies. The fact that Satan has everywhere intruded his corrupting influence is no doubt regrettable for many reasons, but it makes no difference in principle. It is not easy to give an answer to this question. One would like to say that Christ had to appear in order to deliver mankind from evil, But when one considers that evil was originally slipped into the scheme of things by Satan, and still is, then it would seem much simpler if Yahweh would, for once, call this practical joker severely to account, get rid of his pernicious influence, and thus eliminate the root of all evil. He would then not need the elaborate arrangement of a special incarnation with all the unforeseeable consequences which this entails. One should make clear to oneself what it means when God becomes man. It means nothing less than a world-shaking transformation of God. It means more or less what creation meant in the beginning, namely an objectification of God. At the time of the creation he revealed himself in nature. Now he wants to be more specific and become man. It must be admitted, however, that there was a tendency in this direction right from the start. For when those other human beings who had evidently been created before Adam appeared on the scene along with the highest mammals, Yahweh created on the following day, by a special act of creation, a man who was the image of God. This was the first prefiguration of his becoming man. He took Adam's descendants, especially the people of Israel, into his personal possession. And from time to time he filled this people's prophets with his spirit. All these things were preparatory events and symptoms of a tendency within God to become man. But in omniscience there had existed from all eternity a knowledge of the human nature of God, or of the divine nature of man. That is why, long before Genesis was written, we find corresponding testimonies in the ancient Egyptian records. These intimations and prefigurations of the Incarnation must strike one as either completely incomprehensible or superfluous, since all creation ex nihilo is God's and consists of nothing but God, with the result that man, like the rest of creation, is simply God, become concrete. Prefigurations, however, are not in themselves creative events, but are only stages in the process of becoming conscious. It was only quite late that we realized, or rather are beginning to realize, that God is reality itself, and therefore, last but not least, man. This realization is a millennial process. Chapter 6. In view of the immense problem which we are about to discuss, this excursus on pleuromatic events is not out of place as an introduction. What then is the real reason for the Incarnation as an historical event? In order to answer this question, we have to go rather far back. As we have seen, Yahweh evidently has a disinclination to take his absolute knowledge into account as a counterbalance to the dynamism of his omnipotence. The most instructive example of this is his relation to Satan. It always looks as if Satan were completely uninformed about his son's intentions. That is because he never consults his omniscience. We can only explain this on the assumption that Yahweh was so fascinated by his successive acts of creation, so taken up with them, that he forgot about his omniscience altogether. It is quite understandable that the magical bodying forth of the most diverse objects, which had never before existed in such pristine splendor, should have caused God infinite delight. Sophia's memory is not at fault when she says, "When he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was by him like a master workman, and I was daily his delight." The book of Job still rings with the proud joy of creating when Yahweh points to the huge animals he has successfully turned out. "Behold, Behemoth, which I made as I made you. He is the first of the works of God, made to be lord over his companions." So even in Job's day, Yahweh is still intoxicated with the tremendous power and grandeur of his creation. Compared with this, what are Satan's pinpricks and the lamentations of human beings who were created with the Behemoth, even if they do bear God's image? Yahweh seems to have forgotten this fact entirely, otherwise he would never have ridden so roughshod over Job's human dignity. It is only the careful and far-sighted preparations for Christ's birth which show us that omniscience has begun to have a noticeable effect on Yahweh's actions. A certain philanthropic and universalistic tendency makes itself felt. The children of Israel take something of a second place in comparison with the children of men. After Job, we hear nothing further about new covenants. Proverbs and nomadic utterances seem to be the order of the day, and a real novum now appears on the scene, namely apocalyptic communications. This points to metaphysical acts of cognition, that is, to constellated unconscious contents, which are ready to erupt into consciousness. In all this, as we have said, we discern the helpful hand of Sophia. If we consider Yahweh's behavior up to the reappearance of Sophia as a whole, one indubitable fact strikes us: the fact that his actions are accompanied by an inferior consciousness. Time and again we miss reflection and regard for absolute knowledge. His consciousness seems to be not much more than a primitive awareness, which knows no reflection and no morality. One merely perceives and acts blindly, without conscious inclusion of the subject, whose individual existence raises no problems. Today we would call such a state psychologically unconscious, and in the eyes of the law it would be described as non compos mentis. The fact that consciousness does not perform acts of thinking does not, however, prove that they do not exist. They merely occur unconsciously and make themselves felt indirectly, in dreams, visions, revelations, and instinctive changes of consciousness, whose very nature tells us that they derive from an unconscious knowledge, and are the result of unconscious acts of judgment or unconscious conclusions. Some such process can be observed in the curious change which comes over Yahweh's behavior after the Job episode. There can be no doubt that he did not immediately become conscious of the moral defeat he had suffered at Job's hands. In his omniscience, of course, this fact had been known from all eternity, and it is not unthinkable that the knowledge of it unconsciously brought him into the position of dealing so harshly with Job, in order that he himself should become conscious of something through this conflict, and thus gain new insight. Satan, who, with good reason, later on received the name of Lucifer, knew how to make more frequent and better use of omniscience than did his father. It seems he was the only one among the sons of God who developed that much initiative. At all events, it was he who placed those unforeseen incidents in Yahweh's way, which omniscience knew to be necessary and indeed indispensable for the unfolding and completion of the divine drama. Among these, the case of Job was decisive, and it could only have happened thanks to Satan's initiative. The victory of the vanquished and oppressed is obvious. Job stands morally higher than Yahweh. In this respect, the creature has surpassed the Creator. As always, when an external event touches on some unconscious knowledge, this knowledge can reach consciousness. The event is recognized as a déjà vu, and one remembers a pre-existent knowledge about it. Something of the kind must have happened to Yahweh. Job's superiority cannot be shrugged off. Hence, a situation arises in which real reflection is needed. That is why Sophia steps in. She reinforces the much-needed self-reflection, and thus makes possible Yahweh's decision to become man. It is a decision fraught with consequences. He raises himself above his earlier primitive level of consciousness by indirectly acknowledging that the man Job is morally superior to him, and that therefore he has to catch up and become human himself. Had he not taken this decision, he would have found himself in flagrant opposition to his omniscience. Yahweh must become man precisely because he has done man a wrong. He, the guardian of justice, knows that every wrong must be expiated, and wisdom knows that moral law is above even him. Because his creature has surpassed him, he must regenerate himself. As nothing can happen without a pre-existent pattern, not even creation ex nihilo, which must always resort to the treasure house of eternal images in the fabulous mind of the master workman, the choice of a model for the son who is now about to be begotten lies between Adam, to a limited extent, and Abel, to a much greater extent. Adam's limitation lies in the fact that, even if he is the anthropos, he is chiefly a creature and a father. Abel's advantage is that he is the son well-pleasing to God, begotten and not directly created. One disadvantage has to be accepted. He met with an early death by violence, too early to leave behind him a widow and children, which ought really to be part of human fate if lived to the full. Abel is not the authentic archetype of the son, well-pleasing to God. He is a copy, but the first of the kind to be met with in the Scriptures. The young, dying God is also well known in the contemporary pagan religions, and so is the fratricide motif. We shall hardly be wrong in assuming that Abel's fate refers back to a metaphysical event which was played out between Satan and another son of God with a light nature and more devotion to his father. Egyptian tradition can give us information on this point, Horus and Set. As we have said, the disadvantage prefigured in the Abel type can hardly be avoided because it is an integral part of the mythical son drama, as the numerous pagan variants of this motif show. The short dramatic course of Abel's fate serves as an excellent paradigm for the life and death of a god become man. To sum up, the immediate cause of the incarnation lies in Job's elevation, and its purpose is the differentiation of Yahweh's consciousness. For this, a situation of extreme gravity was needed, a peripetia charged with affect, without which no higher level of consciousness can be reached. Chapter 7. In addition to Abel, we have to consider as a model for the impending birth of the Son of God the general pattern of the hero's life which has been established since time immemorial and handed down by tradition. Since this Son is not intended merely as a national Messiah, but as the universal Savior of mankind, we have also to consider the pagan myths and revelations concerning the life of one who is singled out by the gods. The birth of Christ is therefore characterized by all the usual phenomena attendant upon the birth of a hero, such as the Annunciation, the divine generation from a virgin, the coincidence of the birth with the thrice-repeated conjunctio maxima in the sign of Pisces, which at that precise moment inaugurated the new era, the recognition of the birth of a king, the persecution of the newborn, his flight and concealment, his lowly birth, etc. The motif of the growing up of the hero is discernible in the wisdom of the 12-year-old child in the temple, and there are several examples in the Gospels of the breaking away from the mother. It goes without saying that a quite special interest attaches to the character and fate of the incarnate Son of God. Seen from a distance of nearly 2,000 years, it is uncommonly difficult to reconstruct a biographical picture of Christ from the traditions that have been preserved. Not a single text is extant which would fulfill even the minimum modern requirements for writing a history. The historically verifiable facts are extremely scanty, and the little biographically valid material that exists is not sufficient for us to create out of it a consistent career or an even remotely probable character. Certain theologians have discovered the main reasons for this in the fact that Christ's biography and psychology cannot be separated from eschatology. Eschatology means, in effect, that Christ is God and man at the same time, and that he therefore suffers a divine as well as a human fate. The two natures interpenetrate so thoroughly that any attempt to separate them mutilates both. The divine overshadows the human, and the human being is scarcely graspable as an empirical personality. Even the critical procedures of modern psychology do not suffice to throw light on all the obscurities. Every attempt to single out one particular feature for clarity's sake does violence to another, which is just as essential either with respect to his divinity or with respect to his humanity. The commonplace is so interwoven with the miraculous and the mythical that we can never be sure of our facts. Perhaps the most disturbing and confusing thing of all is that the oldest writings, those of St. Paul, do not seem to have the slightest interest in Christ's existence as a concrete human being. The Synoptic Gospels are equally unsatisfactory, as they have more the character of propaganda than of biography. With regard to the human side of Christ, if we can speak of a purely human aspect at all, what stands out particularly clearly is his love of mankind. This feature is already implied in the relationship of Mary to Sophia, and especially in his Genesis by the Holy Ghost, whose feminine nature is personified by Sophia. since she is the preliminary historical form of the Holy Spirit, who is symbolized by the dove, the bird belonging to the love goddess. Furthermore, the love goddess is in most cases the mother of the young dying God. Christ's love of mankind is, however, limited to a not inconsiderable degree by a certain predestinarian tendency which sometimes causes him to withhold his salutary message from those who do not belong to the elect. If one takes the doctrine of predestination literally, it is difficult to see how it can be fitted into the framework of the Christian message. But taken psychologically, as a means to achieving a definite effect, it can readily be understood that these allusions to predestination give one a feeling of distinction. If one knows that one has been singled out by divine choice and intention from the beginning of the world, then one feels lifted beyond the transitoriness and meaninglessness of ordinary human existence and transported to a new state of dignity and importance, like one who has a part in the divine world drama. In this way, man is brought nearer to God, and this is in entire accord with the meaning in the message of the Gospels. Besides his love of mankind, a certain irascibility is noticeable in Christ's character, and, as is often the case with people of emotional temperament, a manifest lack of self-reflection. There is no evidence that Christ ever wondered about himself, or that he ever confronted himself. To this rule there is only one significant exception: the despairing cry from the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Here his human nature attains divinity. At that moment, God experiences what it means to be a mortal man, and drinks to the dregs what he made his faithful servant Job suffer. Here is given the answer to Job, and clearly, this supreme moment is as divine as it is human, as eschatological as it is psychological. And at this moment, too, where one can feel the human being so absolutely, the divine myth is present in full force, and both mean one and the same thing. How, then, can one possibly demythologize the figure of Christ? A rationalistic attempt of that sort would soak all the mystery out of his personality, and what remained would no longer be the birth and tragic fate of a God in time, but, historically speaking, a badly authenticated religious teacher, a Jewish reformer, who was Hellenistically interpreted and misunderstood, a kind of Pythagoras, maybe, or, if you like, a Buddha or a Muhammad, but certainly not a Son of God or a God incarnate. Nor does anybody seem to have realized what would be the consequences of a Christ disinfected of all trace of eschatology. Today we have an empirical psychology which continues to exist despite the fact that the theologians have done their best to ignore it, and with its help we can put certain of Christ's statements under the microscope. If these statements are detached from their mythical context, they can only be explained personalistically. But what sort of conclusion are we bound to arrive at if a statement like, "I am the way and the truth and the life, no one comes to the Father but by me," is reduced to a personal psychology? Obviously, the conclusion as that reached by Jesus' relatives taken when in their ignorance of eschatology they said, "He is beside himself." What is the use of a religion without a mythos? Since religion means, if anything at all, precisely that function which links us back to the eternal myth. In view of these portentous impossibilities, it has been assumed, perhaps as the result of a growing impatience with the difficult factual material, that Christ was nothing but a myth. In this case, no more than a fiction. But myth is not fiction. It consists of facts that are continually repeated and can be observed over and over again. It is something that happens to man, and men have mythical fates just as much as the Greek heroes do. The fact that the life of Christ is largely myth does absolutely nothing to disprove its factual truth. Quite the contrary. I would even go so far as to say that the mythical character of a life is just what expresses its universal human validity. It is perfectly possible, psychologically, for the unconscious or an archetype to take complete possession of a man and to determine his fate down to the smallest detail. At the same time, objective, non-psychic parallel phenomena can occur, which also represent the archetype. It not only seems so, it simply is so, that the archetype fulfills itself not only psychically in the individual, but objectively outside the individual. My own conjecture is that Christ was such a personality. The life of Christ is just what it had to be if it is the life of a God and a man at the same time. It is a symbolum, a bringing together of heterogeneous natures, rather as if Job and Yahweh were combined into a single personality. Yahweh's intention to become man, which resulted from his collision with Job, is fulfilled in Christ's life and suffering.